Today on the Gemcutters Craft, we're going to be looking at pioneer American faceter Roby Buchanan and his antique faceting machine. Last year when I was driving across America looking for the earliest sources of American gem cutting, I came across a museum in the Blue Ridge Mountains in North Carolina that was run by the Parks Department. It's a really small museum, just a couple of rooms, and as I was browsing through the museum, an audio recorder started playing when I entered one of the rooms.
Roby Buchanan was the oldest gem cutter there was in this country. His daddy had an old-timey water wheel that he ground corn for the public. And Roby, he made his own machine, a facet machine. And he hooked it up to his daddy's water wheel while his daddy was grinding corn and he was cutting a gemstone.
Now the recording is a miner who was mining back in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, and during this story that he tells in the recording, he starts talking about a gem cutter called Roby Buchanan. He tells in the story that Roby hooked up a gem cutting machine, specifically a faceting machine, to his father's water wheel powered grinding mill and starts cutting gemstones. Now when I heard this, I was really shocked because I hadn't heard any stories about faceting up in North Carolina, and I wanted to learn something more about who this guy was and what this was with this gem cutting mill and the water wheel power. So I looked online and couldn't find anything, and I went through my sources and also couldn't find anything about this name, so I emailed the Parks Department to see if they knew anything more about this mysterious gem cutter. And amazingly enough, they sent me back a really nice email about a week later giving me a ton of information about Roby Buchanan, including some photos. So while I was looking for information about Roby and his story, I discovered that there is a National Geographic issue from June of 1958, which actually has an article that features Roby in it. In the article, there's a picture of Roby, and his gem cutting machine is visible in the corner. Now, as soon as I saw this, I was hooked. I had to know everything about this guy, who he was, where he was, how he got this machine going, and what was the whole story. And since then, I've been able to piece things together and find all kinds of information about Roby, so I wanted to take a minute to tell his story here. Roby Buchanan was born June 8, 1903 in Hawk, North Carolina. Now, Hawk, North Carolina is not a city, it's not even a town, it's literally just a small mountain mining village up in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Roby was coming from a family of miners. His father and his grandfather were mica miners, and they lived in this area where lots of mining was going on. Not only mica, but for other materials that are used for industrial purposes, such as household cleaners, and not too far away, they were also mining emeralds. Now during this time, emerald mining was in full swing in North Carolina. Today we don't hear anything about emeralds from North Carolina because the mine has long been closed. But in Roby's day, emeralds were coming out, and even Tiffany & Co. was connected to the mine for at least a year or two. So Roby's father was a miner, but in his free time he was a miller. He had a grist mill that was running off of a water wheel in a creek, and people from the town and neighboring villages would come by and bring him the grain that they'd grown, and he would put it into the mill and grind it up into flour so that they could make things out of it. So he's a miller and he is a miner. When Roby was 19, he started to think about gem cutting. So this is 1922. He gets curious in gems, probably from his family tradition of mining and seeing all the rocks that they're working with, stuff that they're pulling out, and he wants to learn how to do it. He wants to cut stones. So he writes to the Library of Congress in Washington to try to get a book about gem cutting, but they don't have one. So since he can't find what he wants to know, he starts writing to all these jewelers and gem cutters that he can find through advertisements and publications, and he says he writes to 50 of the biggest jewelers in the country, and they write back to him saying, either they don't know or they're not going to tell him, and he's going to have to figure it out himself because they've been trained professionally by gem cutters before them, and they're not going to reveal the secrets to anybody, especially not this miller from the mountains of North Carolina. So he goes about thinking about this. He's working on the problem, thinking about it, trying to figure out what he can do. Meanwhile, his father becomes ill, and Roby has to take over the milling operation. So he's farming, he's grinding the local meal for the local farmers, and in his free time, He's trying to solve this problem of how to cut a stone. So at this time, Roby didn't know anything about gem cutting. He's trying everything he can think of, even trying to take a chisel and actually carve out the facets on the stone. And of course, this doesn't really work. Now, he does have some kind of method for grinding. If we think about the grist mill, it's literally two pieces of sandstone that kind of grind together with the water wheel power and grind the grains. Now, if we were to take this sandstone wheel, flip it up on its side, and transpose that to Germany in the 1400s, we've got a classic Idar Oberstein style sandstone grinding wheel, which is exactly how all the Germans were grinding their gemstones way back in the day. But Roby doesn't know about this, and I don't know if he tried this or not, but evidently he didn't continue on the path of using the sandstone wheel to grind the gem. Instead, he looks elsewhere. He starts to cobble together some different pieces of kit and builds himself a different kind of a grinding wheel, and he doesn't have any electricity up in Hawk, North Carolina, so he knows that he's going to have to use the water wheel to power this new machine that he's building. So over the course of 3 or 4 months, he works on his gears and his pulleys and attaches this whole new mechanism that he's built to the water wheel. So when he's not grinding the grain for the local farmers, he can pull this lever and kind of switch gears, and instead of turning the grist mill, he's now turning his gem cutting mill. He's got half of what he needs. He's got his grinding thing, and he's got the stone that he wants to cut, but how is he actually going to hold it on there to facet the stone? This is where it gets interesting. There's an article in 1935 which shows a picture of Buchanan using this new device. And when I saw the image, I couldn't believe my eyes. Again, what I saw in that previous photo from the National Geographic is shown here at an even earlier date. And in the article, it talks about the fact that he went down to Greenville, North Carolina, and came back with a gadget to help him cut his stones. Now, he doesn't give any details about why he went to North Carolina or what this gadget is, but I saw the photo and I knew exactly what it was because I had just seen this exact device a couple months ago while I was traveling across the country. Now, if we look again at this National Geographic photo, or if we look at the article photo from 1935, we can see exactly what he's using. Notice in the 1935 photo, we can see a corner of an arc that is parallel with the table, and he's got a vertical grinding wheel with a faceting device pointing at it. Now, if we look back at the National Geographic photo, we can see the same exact device sitting on the desk in the left bottom corner of the picture. Again, no details on the image, but I knew exactly what it was, and I knew exactly who was living in North Carolina in 1935. The hero of my story, the main character of the early days of American gem cutting, J. Harry Howard. Now, J. Harry Howard was probably the biggest influencer of the 1930s gem cutting movement. He'd written a pamphlet and a book about gem cutting, and in 1931 he started producing faceting machines in association with the William Dixon Company in New Jersey. So when Roby Buchanan goes down to North Carolina, what he's doing is following the paper trail of the ads for this machine, and what he comes back with is the exact same machine that J. Harry Howard shows us in his book about gem cutting in 1935. Now, the article doesn't say that Buchanan ever met Howard, and it doesn't even mention Howard, but we can see from the machine that he's using, he definitely went down, met J. Harry Howard, bought one of the machines that he was selling, and most undoubtedly got a lot of tips and tricks about grinding, cutting, polishing, and how to use this machine. So when Buchanan gets back to his grinding mill, he attaches this J. Harry Howard faceting machine, the Dixon Howard No. 2 as it's properly called, to the grinding wheel that he has rigged up to his water wheel, and he starts cutting. And he says within a couple of months he has faceted his first garnet and he sells it for $20, and this financial return inspires him to keep on going. Now, he keeps experimenting, cutting, and polishing for the next 10 years. By the time we get to the early 1940s, likely 1944, we find out that an act of nature has flooded Cane Creek, which is the waterway that Roby's water wheel was working off of, and this flood completely destroys the water wheel and destroys the whole mill. And so Roby's days as a miller are now over. He loses the whole device that he's using to cut gems, but he's doing so good as a gem cutter at that time, he doesn't need to be a miller anymore. He doesn't need to be a farmer anymore. Roby has become officially a professional gem cutter. So he starts to rebuild. And instead of rebuilding the water wheel, he decides that this new machine that he's going to use is going to be electric powered. So he builds a new device. And in an article from 1945, we see his new setup, and things have changed dramatically. Notice in these 1945 photos, he's no longer using J. Harry Howard's machine, which uses this big arc system to grind against a vertical wheel. He's now using a horizontal wheel, this new electric wheel, but amazingly enough, he's changed faceting machines. And this is the part of the story that really has blown my mind. So already we've said that Roby directly knew J. Harry Howard, and he was connected to this early pioneering American story. Now this is when things get really interesting. When Roby rebuilds his whole setup, he changes faceting heads, and the picture that we see in 1945 is now the gem cutting machine from Maine that was developed by Loren Merrill back in the 1890s. Now this is just crazy to me. Loren Merrill is the absolute great-grandfather of American faceting. He's the first person in America to ever have built an index-based faceting machine, and he's using this big arc system with this quill that comes out and uses a horizontal wheel. So now Roby has a very interesting place in our story because he's connected directly with J. Harry Howard and was starting out cutting with that machine, but once he rebuilds his studio, he is now connected to the Gemcutters in Maine and has bought one of their gem cutting heads, which is what J. Harry Howard's machine was based on. So instead of using a vertical wheel and moving the big arc this way, we now have an arc that works this way, giving the angle, and has an index gear and quill facing the horizontal lap. And this, to me, is just crazy. Roby is probably the only person to have directly connected with the faceting machine of J. Harry Howard and the faceting machine of Loren Merrill, and has used both of them up in his grist mill in Hawk, North Carolina. Now here's where things take an interesting turn for me personally. So I had put all this information together, and I was totally fixated on Roby and this amazing connection between the Cutters of Maine and J. Harry Howard himself. And then the most amazing thing happened. An eBay alert comes into my inbox, and I check it out, and I could not believe my eyes when I looked at the close-up photos. Behold the gem cutting machine of Roby Buchanan. Now, if we look closely at the machine, we can see that it says, manufactured by Gems by Roby, Box 219, Route 4, Bakersville, North Carolina. Now, Bakersville, North Carolina is the town closest to Hawk, North Carolina, and it's where the post office is. So this is where Roby's local post office is and where he was shipping out these machines that he had started to manufacture. So let's take a closer look. Now, Roby's faceting machine that he started to sell is an exact duplicate of the machine that Loren Merrill was using all the way back in the 1890s. It's got a big arc that allows the cutter to change the angle of the quill and change the angle of the stone that's being cut, and it's got notches for angles going from 90 all the way to 0, and he can hit every single angle in here as he goes. There's even a little arrow gauge to point at the facet that he's working on, and he can push this little thing up and actually lock in the index. So that's the angle. That's the first control. Now the second control is this device, and this is the exact piece of kit that we can see in that National Geographic article. It was seeing this, the back of this thing, that led me on this whole journey, because I recognized this as the piece from J. Harry Howard's machine, because I had just seen this in the McKissick Museum in North Carolina when I had been there just a couple weeks before. So this was fresh in my mind, and when I saw that picture, I knew exactly what it was. So let's look closely at the head. So we've got a 64 index gear, though it's divided up in a very weird way. It goes from 0 to 30, and in between each number, there's 3 extra index teeth. So he could go, and anywhere around the circle with 64, though he wasn't numbering it in the same way that we would number a 64 index today. Now, the machine has a series of dops. Some of them are cones, some of them are flat. A lot of them are double-sided with different size cones so that he didn't need so much gear. He simply could put this in, tighten the set screw, or if he wanted to use the other side, the other size, he could flip it around, put this in, tighten the set screw, and that would allow him to have a dop. It even comes with a dop with a table adapter so that he could take out his stone, put in the table adapter, and attach his dop into the table adapter just like we would today to cut our tables. So he would put his angle to 45 degrees and be able to cut a stone. Now, the one thing that this type of device does not give us is a height control. So this bit is attached directly to the table, and we can lift up the stone to see what we're doing and put it back down to cut. We could even theoretically sweep, though I doubt that they did, but we cannot go up and down the way that a modern machine could do. So this is one of the big differences of these early American machines. They're missing the third control. So if you've got your machine on, for instance, 70 degrees, which is where I've got this one, and you put your stone down, and it's a small stone, maybe you're on 70 degrees, but if you have a big stone, it's going to raise up, and it's not going to be on 70 degrees anymore. So it would have been very hard for them to know the exact angle, even though that we see that the angles are listed. The size of the stone is going to change the angle of the quill, and not having a height control means that you're never exactly sure, are you really on 60? Are you actually on 61? Or something like that. But the fact that I was able to find this is amazing. The fact that this still exists is amazing. And the fact that we can piece this story together through all these articles and pictures and references is something that completely fills me as a researcher with joy. So just to continue on a little bit with Roby's story, by 1956, Roby was becoming well known. He had articles in local papers, and word of mouth was letting tourists know that there was something interesting going on up in Hawk, North Carolina. He said by the summer of 1956, up to 1,000 people were coming up to his little shop and visiting him and seeing what he was doing, and of course, buying his stones and buying the jewelry that they were making. In one article, he says that the more facets, the better, and on one stone, he cut up to 800 facets on the stone. I'm guessing this must have been a huge stone, but it really just blows my mind to think about cutting 800 facets and polishing them on this crude faceting machine. By 1956, he starts teaching lapidary at the Penland School of Handicraft and is spreading the knowledge and most likely spreading the faceting machines that he's selling. In 1965, there's an interview done with Roby, and he recalls that he's the first one in the South to have ever done this. He said in his area, people would have thought it was crazy to pick up a rock and keep it, but he had a different idea. He wanted to learn how to cut all the way back at age 19, and this desire and this quest for knowledge changed his whole life. He started cutting in the early 1930s, and he cuts all the way until his death in 1974. His wife died about 10 years earlier, and he gets remarried in 1968, and his new wife even starts becoming a gem cutter herself. So it was truly a family business. He was cutting stones with his wife, with his children, with his close family. They started a company, they started making their own machines, they started making jewelry with the stones that they were cutting, and they completely changed their family's story forever. Today, Roby Buchanan is buried in the Cane Creek Baptist Church Cemetery in Hawk, North Carolina, and as far as I know, the shed that he was cutting gems in still stands today. So next time I get up to North Carolina, I'm definitely going to check that out, and I will definitely give you an update video. But until then, thank you for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Gemcutters Craft and looked a little bit deeper into the interesting world of 1930s American gem cutting. Please like the video and subscribe, and if you've been enjoying these videos for the last year or 2 years or 6 years, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. This is a way to financially support the work that I'm doing and help me so I can continue to tell this story of not only American gem cutting, but gem cutting around the world, and keep making these videos for free. You guys have a nice day, and I'll see you next time on the Gemcutters Craft.